On the 7th of August, 1860, a canary yellow carriage came up Fifth Avenue in New York. By the accounts that survive, it was an absurd object, enormous, painted a yellow you could see from a long way down the block. The kind of vehicle a man buys when he has stopped worrying about what anyone thinks. A woman on the sidewalk stopped walking when she saw who was sitting on the seat beside the driver. I have gone back to that afternoon more often than I can easily explain. The man in the carriage was Isaac Merritt Singer, and by that summer, his sewing machines were going out of a shop on Mott Street at a rate of $13,000 a year into houses in every state in the country. The woman on the sidewalk had lived as his wife for 24 years and had borne him 10 children. The woman on the seat beside him was somebody else entirely. And the strangest fact in the whole arrangement is that neither of those women was legally his wife, and one of them was about to find out what that meant. He left home at 11 years old and spent his 20s as a touring actor, performing under the stage name Merritt, which he would later hand to one of the women as a married surname. The machine he sold cost about $125 in a decade, when the average American household lived on about $500 a year. He ran 3 households in one city under 3 different surnames. Singer on Fifth Avenue, Matthews in one house, Merritt in another. By that summer, he had acknowledged 18 children. The final number is somewhere near 24, and the sources have never agreed on it. He divorced his only legal wife by accusing her of adultery, which was the sole ground for divorce the state of New York allowed, and which would remain the sole ground for another 106 years. When the woman he had lived with for 24 years finally moved against him, she won the largest alimony award the state had ever granted, and his lawyers negotiated it down in private and got her to sign away every claim she had. He patented the carriage. It sits in the federal record to this day as patent number 25,920. He died 15 years later in a mansion in Devon with an estate of about $13 million, and the will cut it into 60 parts. And he was arrested exactly once in his life. It happened on that avenue, on that August afternoon. The charge was assault. No court in America ever indicted him for bigamy. Not once. In a decade when ordinary men were going to state prison for 5 years for a fraction of what he did. Every one of those things is documented. None of them is the strangest part. This is the story of a man who ran 3 households under 3 different names in one city and fathered roughly 24 children while the country bought his sewing machines by the 100,000. It is also the story of how a fortune turned a crime that sent ordinary men to state prison into a private matter that could be closed with a settlement, and of why no court in America ever once charged him with it. I want to start on the avenue on that afternoon, with the carriage and the woman on the sidewalk, before the lawyers and the settlement and the 60 parts. Before we go on, one quick thing. Subscribing helps build a community around stories like this. It rewards the work behind them. Chapter 1. The Yellow Carriage. Fifth Avenue in 1860 was where New York kept the people it had decided to take seriously. Brick and brownstone, iron railings, the addresses that meant a man had arrived somewhere. Isaac Singer had moved his family into number 14 the year before, and he had done it the way he did everything, loudly and without any apparent sense that the neighbors were watching. The carriage was the loudest thing he owned. It was bright yellow, it was enormous, and he had gone to the trouble of patenting it, which tells you something about the man before you know anything else about him. A man who commissions a vanity vehicle is usually content to own it. Singer took his to the patent office and secured a federal property right in it. He had spent his life around patents by then. He understood exactly what the law was for, and what it would protect, and he made sure it protected the carriage. New York society had already made up its mind about him, which is worth saying because it explains why the Avenue was watching in the first place. The money was enormous, and the man was impossible. He was loud in a decade that prized restraint. He had come up from the theater, which was not a respectable place to have come up from, and he spent on a scale that read to the brownstone families as an announcement rather than a life. They took the machines into their houses and kept the man out of them. Mary Ann Sponsler was on the sidewalk that afternoon. She had met him in Baltimore in 1836, when he was a touring actor with no money and she was young, and she had been with him for 24 years since. She had borne him 10 children. She used his name. She ran his house. Every person in her life understood her to be Mrs. Singer, and she understood it too. The woman on the seat beside him was Mary McGonigal. What happened next is reported in several places, and the reports do not fully agree, which is a sentence that will come up again in this account more than once. What is clear is that there was a confrontation, that it went back to the house, and that it turned violent. Singer beat Mary Ann Sponsler. He beat their daughter Vuleti as well, by the accounts that survive, and he beat them badly enough that the matter did not stay inside the house, which by the standards of 1860 took some doing. Domestic violence in that decade was very close to invisible in law. It took a great deal for a beating to become a public event. This one became a public event. Singer was arrested. And here is where I have to stop and deal with a sentence, because that sentence is the reason the whole affair is remembered at all. You will read, in a great many places, that Mary Ann Sponsler had her husband arrested for bigamy on Fifth Avenue in 1860. It appears in encyclopedias. It appears in the potted biographies. It is the version that has traveled, because it is a good sentence and because it has the shape of justice. I have not been able to find a court record, an indictment, a docket, or a trial report that supports it. What the contemporaneous reporting supports is something narrower and, when you sit with it, considerably worse. A weekly illustrated paper of the period reported that Mr. Singer of number 14 Fifth Avenue had been arrested for beating his wife. The charge was assault. He was placed under an order to keep the peace, and he was released on bond, and he walked out. The difference between those two sentences is the whole story. In one of them, the law catches a bigamist. In the other, the law notices a beating and lets the man post bond and go home to the house he kept the beaten woman in. She was not his wife. That is the part that has to sit underneath everything that follows. After 24 years and 10 children, Mary Ann Sponsler had no legal standing at all, and the reason is colder than a missing wedding. Catherine Haley was alive and undivorced for that entire quarter century, and a man with a living wife cannot take another one. No ceremony would have made Mary Ann his wife. No number of years living as one would have either. She could not divorce him, because you cannot divorce a man you never married. She could not have him charged with bigamy, because bigamy required a second wedding, and he had been careful never to hold one. He had built it that way. That is what took me a long time to understand about the carriage. He was a man who knew precisely what the law would grip and what it would slide off. He put a federal number on a piece of yellow woodwork. He never put anything on her. To understand how a man arrives at that, you have to go back a long way, to a boy who walked out of a house in upstate New York and spent the next 20 years learning to be somebody else for a living. Chapter 2. The Merritt Players. Isaac Merritt Singer was born in the autumn of 1811 in Rensselaer County, New York, the youngest of 8 children of a German immigrant millwright named Adam Singer and his wife, Ruth. The sources give slightly different days for the birth and different names for the village, which is a small thing. but it is the first sign of a pattern. This man's life is thinly documented at the start and heavily disputed at the end, and he is one of the few figures of his century who seems to have preferred it that way. His parents' marriage broke apart when he was about 10. His mother left. It is one of the very few facts about his childhood that everyone agrees on, and it is difficult to read the next 60 years without it. By 11 or 12, he was gone from the house himself. What he did next is the part that explains the rest. He went into the theater. For most of his 20s and into his 30s, he was an itinerant actor, moving between towns with touring companies, playing whatever needed playing, and he did it under a name. On the stage, he was not Isaac Singer, he was Isaac Merritt, or simply Merritt. And that name would follow him for the rest of his life and eventually be handed to a woman in Lower Manhattan as a married surname. I want to be careful about the temptation here, because it is a strong one. It would be easy to draw a neat line from the runaway boy to the stage name to the 3 households and call the whole thing explained. Plenty of men have had bad childhoods and taken stage names and gone on to live ordinary lives. The line does not draw itself. But the alias came first. That is worth holding on to. The second self was not invented to hide the women. It was in place years before there were any women to hide. And when he needed it later, it was already sitting there, worn in and comfortable. A name he had answered to for 20 years. In 1830, at 19, he married Catherine Maria Haley. She was about 15. Their son William came in 1834, their daughter Lillian in 1837. In 1836, touring in Baltimore, he met Mary Ann Sponsler. She was, by every account, taken with him. He was an actor with a good face and a large manner, and he told her he was going to marry her, and the fact that he already had a wife was not something he brought up. A child was born to Mary Ann in 1837, the same year Catherine bore Lillian. So from 1837 onward, and this is worth stating in one breath because he lived it in one breath, Isaac Singer had a legal wife with 2 children and another woman with a child of his in a different city, and he was moving between them under 2 different names, and he had not yet invented anything that made a dollar. The inventions came, but not the money. In 1839, he patented a machine for drilling rock and sold the rights for $2,000, which was a real sum, the kind that could have set a family up. He spent all of it on a theatrical troupe. He called it the Merritt Players, after himself, after the version of himself he preferred, and he took it on the road for about 5 years until the money ran out. In 1849, he patented a machine for carving wood and metal. It was a good machine. It did not sell. The pattern in those years is worth naming because it is the same pattern that runs through everything after. He could see a mechanism and fix it. He could not see a business, and he could not stay anywhere. He would land somewhere, build something clever, fall out with whoever had paid for it, and move. The theatrical troupe was the purest version of it. He took the only real money he had ever earned, $2,000 from a rock drill, and spent every cent of it on a company of actors with his own stage name over the door. By the summer of 1850, he was 38 years old. He had 2 households, several children, 2 patents, no capital, and a wrecked theatrical career behind him. By the standards of the century, he was a failure with a talent for machines and a habit of leaving. Then he walked into a machine shop in Boston, and in 11 days, he did the thing that made all the rest of it possible. If you have made it this far, you should probably subscribe. It is free, and it is what keeps these coming. Chapter 3, 11 Days. The shop was at number 19 Harvard Place in Boston, and it belonged to a man named Orson Phelps. Phelps had a contract to build sewing machines of a design called the Lero and Blodgett, And the trouble with the Lero and Blodgett was that it barely worked. The mechanism ran the shuttle in a circle, which twisted the thread, which meant the machine had to be stopped and the thread untangled often enough that a person sewing by hand was competitive with it. Phelps was making them and watching them come back. Singer was there to sell his carving machine, which nobody wanted. He looked at the sewing machines instead. What he said about them afterward was the sort of thing he always said, which is that the design was wrong and he could see the fix. In his case, it happened to be true. He proposed a straight shuttle moving back and forth instead of in a circle, a straight needle moving up and down instead of curved and sideways, and a foot to hold the cloth down against the needle's rise. He needed money. It came from George Zieber, a Philadelphia bookseller who had already backed Singer's carving machine and had already put in something on the order of $3,000 for the Massachusetts rights to a device that never sold. Zieber put in more. On the 18th of September, 1850, the three men signed an agreement. Phelps would provide the shop and the mechanical skill. Zieber would provide the money. Singer would provide, and this is the language the agreement itself used, inventive genius. The whole enterprise was capitalized at $40. Then, Singer built the machine. He worked, by his own later telling, without much sleep, and in 11 days he had a working prototype that sewed a straight seam and kept sewing it. On the 12th of August, 1851, the Patent Office granted patent number 8294, an improvement in sewing machines, to Isaac Merritt Singer. It is worth being exact about what he had actually done, because the popular version overstates it, and the overstatement matters. He did not invent the sewing machine. The lock stitch was Elias Howe's. Other essential elements belonged to other men. What Singer contributed was the presser foot, and the arrangement that let the thing sew a continuous line, straight or curving, without stopping. That sounds modest. It was the difference between a laboratory curiosity and a machine a woman could actually sew a shirt on. And it was worth more than every other piece of the puzzle combined, because it was the piece that made the rest of them useful. I have spent a while with the $40, because the $40 is the joke that runs under this entire fortune. 3 men and $40 in a Boston machine shop. And inside 20 years, it is one of the first American multinationals, with a factory in New Jersey employing 3,000 people and another one outside Glasgow. The men who were in the room did not stay in the room. Phelps sold out early and went back to making machines for other people. Zieber, the man whose money had paid for the thing, got sick. He was in bed, ill enough that a doctor was called, and by the account that has come down, Singer arrived at the bedside and let him know the doctor had said grave things, and that his interest ought to be settled while there was time to settle it. Zieber sold. He got $6,000. $6,000 was a genuine return on 40. Set it against what the interest became, and it stops being a return and becomes an amputation. There was another partner for a moment, a Brooklyn salt bag manufacturer named Barzillai Ransom, an elderly man who took a share in 1851 against promissory notes worth up to $10,000. He lasted a very short time. When he withdrew, he said of Singer, in substance, that the man was a dictator and insufferable, and that he wanted nothing further to do with him. That is the pattern of the business from the beginning. Singer got the credit, kept the patent, and the men who financed him left with a fraction and a low opinion. What he had now was a patent and a temper. What he did not have was a company. That came from a lawyer who found him repellent and worked with him for 12 years anyway. Chapter 4. $5 down. Edward Cabot Clark was everything Isaac Singer was not. He was Williams educated, correct, cold, careful, and a lawyer of the sort who reads the whole document. He came into the business in 1851, and the firm became I.M. Singer and Company. Clark took the patent problem first, because there was a large one. A man named Elias Howe held an 1846 patent on the lock stitch itself, the fundamental idea underneath every practical sewing machine, including Singer's, and Howe had been suing everyone in the trade. In 1854, he won. Singer had to settle, and by the reported figures, he paid something in the range of $25,000 to $28,000 in back claims, and agreed to a royalty on every machine after that. Then, in 1856, the industry did something clever enough that it has been copied ever since. Instead of continuing to sue one another into the ground, the major makers pooled their patents. Orlando Potter, a lawyer who ran Grover & Baker, proposed it, and the makers met at Albany and formed what became known as the sewing machine combination. Any manufacturer could license the whole necessary bundle of patents for a fee of $15 a machine. Howe, whose patent underlay the lot, took $5 on every machine sold in the United States and $1 on every machine exported. It was the first important patent pool in American history. Every industry that came afterward and needed to stop killing itself in court, automobiles, aircraft, radio, learned the shape of the answer from a room full of sewing machine men in Albany in 1856. Howe got rich on it. How rich is one of the places the sources part company. One account puts his total royalties at about $1,185,000. Another, based on what Howe himself claimed when he applied to renew the patent in 1867, puts it near $2 million. Both numbers describe a man who invented a stitch and was paid for it by everyone who used it. But the thing that actually built the Singer fortune was not the patent. It was an idea Clark had about money. The machine cost about $125. In that decade, the average American household lived on about $500 a year. Sit with those two numbers because everything else sits on top of them. The device that was going to liberate the American housewife cost a quarter of everything her family earned in a year. Nobody had $125. The market Singer needed did not exist at that price, and no amount of advertising was going to create it. So Clark let people buy it without having the money, about $5 down, and the rest paid monthly, and the machine went home with you today. In February of 1856, the company added a trade-in, $50 off for your old machine, whoever had made it. That is the invention, not the shuttle and not the presser foot. The invention was that an American family could own a thing before it could afford it, and would keep paying for years to keep owning it. Installment credit for the working household starts here, in the sewing machine trade, and every car loan and store card that came after it is downstream of Clark's arithmetic. The numbers moved the way numbers move when the pricing problem gets solved. 2,564 machines in 1856, 13,000 in 1860, 127,833 by 1870, and the margin under it was extraordinary. A machine that retailed north of $100 could be built for about $23. The company got out ahead of the country fast. By 1867, there was a factory in the Glasgow area, and by 1873, the plant at Elizabethport in New Jersey employed 3,000 people across more than 1.5 million square feet of floor. A firm that had been 3 men and $40 in a Boston shop 23 years earlier was now one of the first American businesses to manufacture on 2 continents and sell on all of them. And all of it was sold on an image of the American home. The advertising was domestic, wholesome, a wife at her machine in a clean parlor. The founder of the company was at that moment running 3 households under 3 names, and the company's own marketing had no room for him in it at all. Clark could not stand him. That is the part worth holding. The 2 men were partners for over a decade, and Clark's opinion of Singer's private life was, by every surviving indication, disgust. He kept working. There was too much money in it to stop, and the arrangement they had built was making both of them wealthy on a scale neither could have reached alone. While Clark was inventing the machine that sold the machine, Singer was building something else in the same city. It had 3 addresses. Subscribing keeps work like this coming, and it is free. That is the whole of the ask. Chapter 5. 3 names. Here is what the New York statute actually required, because the statute is the hinge that everything else turns on. To be guilty of bigamy in that state in that century, a man had to do a specific thing. He had to go through a marriage ceremony while a previous lawful spouse was still living and the previous marriage was still undissolved. The offense was the second ceremony, not the second household, not the second family, not the second name, the ceremony. The penalty ran to 5 years in state prison. Isaac Singer never held a second ceremony. For 24 years, he never married any of them. By the end of the 1850s, the architecture looked like this. At number 14 Fifth Avenue, there was Mary Ann Sponsler, living as Mrs. Singer, with 10 children born to her over 24 years. Isaac Augustus, Vuleti Teresa, John Albert, Fanny Elizabeth, Jasper Hamlet, Mary Olivia, Julia Ann, Caroline Virginia. The names are worth saying out loud because there is a way of telling it where they become a number. In another house there was Mary McGonigal, who had worked for him, living as Mrs. Matthews. 5 children who grew up under the Matthews name: Ruth Mary, Clara, Margaret, Charles Alexander, Florence Adelaide. In Lower Manhattan, there was Mary Eastwood Walters, living as Mrs. Merritt. The old stage name, back in service. A daughter, Alice Eastwood Merritt. 3 surnames, 1 man, 1 city, at the same time. And the McGonigal household was closer to the center than any of the others, because Mary McGonigal had come to him through the business. She had worked for him. So had, by some accounts, other women whose names attached to him more loosely, and who are named in the record too thinly to state anything about with confidence. What can be said is that the man who was building the machine that employed American women had arranged his private life so that the women closest to him were, in one way or another, on the payroll. And somewhere behind all of it, still legally married to him until 1860, was Catherine Maria Haley, the girl of 15 he had married in 1830, with her 2 children. There may have been a 5th. One account of the period lists another household under the name Judson, and the woman who kept it has come down to us with no first name at all. That is the shape of the record here. A man is remembered down to his patent numbers. A woman in his life can be remembered as a surname and a rumor. The thing that gets called bigamy on the front of this account was, in the eyes of the state of New York, no crime at all. There was no second ceremony to prosecute. He was a married man who kept women, and the law had a word for the women and no charge for the man. I keep coming back to how much work that took. It would be a comfort to think of this as a man losing control of himself, sprawling into appetite too disorganized to stop. The record shows the opposite. He kept the names straight for a quarter of a century. He kept the household separate in a city of 600,000 people. He remembered which name belonged in which house. He fathered 18 acknowledged children across those addresses and kept every one of them from disturbing the arrangement. That is not appetite, that is administration. and it was administration in exactly the direction the law was weakest. He gave the carriage a patent number because carriages were property, and property could be registered and defended. He gave the women names he had made up because there was no register for that and nothing to defend. A man who understood the patent system as well as he did understood the other thing too. The state protected what it could write down. For 24 years, the design held. It held because Marianne Sponsler believed she was his wife, and because the other households did not know enough to ask, and because a city of that size could still hide 3 addresses from one another. It stopped holding on a sidewalk on Fifth Avenue on a summer afternoon, and the woman standing on that sidewalk had no idea yet that the 24 years behind her had never legally happened. Chapter 6. Marianne. Marianne Sponsler was born in 1817, met Isaac Singer in Baltimore in 1836 when she was 19, and spent the next 24 years being told she was married to him. That is the whole of what the century gave her, and it is worth slowing down over, because there is a version of this account where she is a plot device. She is the woman on the sidewalk. She is the trigger for the scandal. She exists to see the carriage and set the machinery going. She was a person for 24 years before she was a trigger. He told her early that he intended to marry her. He did not mention Catherine Haley, who was alive in New York and legally his wife. Marianne bore him a child in 1837, the same year Catherine bore Lillian, and from that year forward, Marianne was raising his children in one house, while another woman raised his children in another, and only one of the 2 women knew. She bore 10 children: Isaac Augustus, Vuleti Teresa, John Albert, Fanny Elizabeth, Jasper Hamlet, Mary Olivia, Julia Ann, Caroline Virginia, 2 others who did not survive childhood. She used his name on every one of the birth records that survive. She used it at the door. She used it with the servants, with the neighbors, with the tradesmen, with everyone in her life for a quarter of a century, and every one of them believed her, because there was no reason on earth not to. What she knew and when she knew it is one of the genuinely unresolved questions here, and the record does not settle it. There are indications she suspected something for years. There are other indications that the McGonigal household and the Walters household were entirely invisible to her until the very end. Both readings have support, neither has proof. What can be said is that she was in an impossible position long before she knew she was in it. Because here is what 24 years and 10 children had actually bought her. In the law of the state of New York in 1860. Nothing. Not a claim, not a standing. Not a name that any court would recognize. She was not a wife, because Catherine Haley was alive and undivorced the whole time, and nothing Marianne did or signed or waited for could have changed that. She was not a widow in waiting, because she was not a wife. She could not divorce him, because you cannot dissolve a marriage that never legally existed. She could not inherit. She could not sue as a spouse. She had no more legal relationship to Isaac Singer than the woman who sold him a newspaper. And she could not have him charged with bigamy, which is the cruelest turn of the whole arrangement, because bigamy required a second ceremony. And the only reason there had never been a second ceremony was that he had never bothered to marry her in the first place. The absence of the wedding was the thing that made the crime impossible. Her injury was the same fact as his immunity. There is one more thing about her that outlasts everything else in the record. Almost everything we know about Isaac Singer's private life, the households, the names, the arrangement, the violence, comes from her. It comes from the complaint she filed after it broke, when she had turned on him completely, and wanted the world to know what he was. That is the source. A hostile witness, at the worst moment of her life, with money on the line. And there is nothing on the other side of it. There is no memoir, there is no journal, there are no letters in which Isaac Singer explains himself. Because Isaac Singer could barely write. What survives in his hand is a scatter of misspelled notes to Clark, mostly about money. He built one of the great fortunes of the century and left almost no interior record of himself at all. The fullest portrait we have of the man was drawn by the woman who came to hate him, and he never wrote a word to contradict it. In 1859, he moved her and her children into the mansion at number 14 Fifth Avenue. It was the best address she had ever had. She was 43 years old. She had been somebody's wife for 24 years. She had never once been married. Subscribing is how work like this keeps finding you. It is free. Chapter 7, 14 Fifth Avenue. The house at number 14 Fifth Avenue was the summit of the whole climb, and it lasted about a year. By 1859, the money had become genuinely enormous. The machines were going out at $13,000 a year and climbing toward $100,000. The company was manufacturing on 2 continents, and Isaac Singer, who had walked out of a house in Rensselaer County at 11 with nothing, was living on the best street in the richest city in the country, with a household staff and a wife who was not his wife, and 18 children he had acknowledged spread across 3 addresses in the same city. New York would not have him. That is the thing about the Fifth Avenue year that the address conceals. The brownstone families took the machines and refused the man. He was theatrical, he was loud, he had come up through touring companies, and his private arrangements were beginning to be the sort of thing people had heard about, even if they could not have said exactly what they had heard. By the standards of that avenue in that decade, money was necessary and nowhere near sufficient, and Singer had exactly the one thing and none of the other. So, he did what he had always done, which was to become more himself. He commissioned the carriage. There is a pattern in that response worth naming, because it had run through his whole life by then. Shut out of the theater's respectable circles, he had named a company after himself. Shut out by his partner's good opinion, he had kept the patent and let them go. Shut out by Fifth Avenue, he built the loudest object on the street and drove it down the middle of the road. He had never once in 60 years responded to rejection by getting smaller. It was yellow. It was preposterous. It had a federal patent number on it, which no other vanity carriage on that avenue had, because no other man on that avenue had spent his life learning exactly which things the law would defend for you if you asked it properly. And in the same window, quietly, he did something considerably more consequential than buy a carriage. He got divorced. In 1860, he obtained a divorce from Catherine Maria Haley, the girl he had married at 19 in 1830, on the ground of her adultery with a man named Stephen Kent. That sentence has stayed with me, because everything about the man is inside it. New York, in that century, was the hardest place in the Union to get divorced. From the first divorce statute in 1787 until 1966, adultery was the only ground the state would accept. Not cruelty, not desertion, not abandonment. Adultery, proved with corroborating third-party evidence, because a spouse's own admission was not admissible. That regime trapped an enormous number of ordinary women for 179 years. A woman beaten by her husband in 1860 had no ground. There was no exit for her because the statute did not contain one. Isaac Singer, who had been keeping 3 households under 3 names for a quarter of a century, walked into that same statute and used it as a weapon. He was the adulterer. He was the most spectacular adulterer in the state of New York, and he ended his only legal marriage by charging his wife with the offense, and it worked, and he walked out of it a legally single man. That is what the statute could do in the hands of somebody with lawyers. For a few months in 1860, then, everything was aligned. He was free of Catherine. He had Mary Ann on Fifth Avenue believing she was his wife. He had Mary McGonigal in another house as Mrs. Matthews with 5 children. He had Mary Eastwood Walters in Lower Manhattan as Mrs. Merritt. And, by some accounts, Kate McGonigal, Mary's younger sister, had also entered the arrangement. 3 households, 4 women, 1 city, 1 man, and an alias for every door. A city of 600,000 people is large enough to hide that and small enough to make hiding it a full-time occupation. He had run it successfully for 24 years, but it was getting harder, and the households were drifting toward one another, and he had begun to drive a bright yellow carriage through the middle of the borough in broad daylight. On the 7th of August, 1860, the carriage came up the avenue and the design broke. Chapter 8. What he was charged with. What follows is the part of the record that the popular version gets wrong, and the correction is not a technicality. It is the entire point. Mary Ann Sponsler saw the carriage. She saw Mary McGonigal on the seat beside him. Whatever she had suspected across the previous years arrived all at once, in public, on the street where she lived. She confronted him. The confrontation moved back into the house at number 14. And inside that house, Isaac Singer beat her, and beat their daughter Vuletti when Vuletti tried to intervene. And he did it badly enough that it became a matter for the police, which in 1860 took considerable doing. A man's conduct inside his own house was very nearly beyond the reach of the law in that decade. Wife-beating was not, in any practical sense, prosecuted. For a beating to escape a Fifth Avenue townhouse and reach a magistrate, it had to be severe. He was arrested. A weekly illustrated paper of the period carried the item, reporting that Mr. Singer of number 14 Fifth Avenue had been arrested for beating his wife. The charge was assault. Not bigamy, assault. He was put under an order to keep the peace, he posted bond, and he was released. The first chapter left that indictment unfound, and precision matters here because this is the load-bearing claim of the entire account. You will read almost everywhere that Mary Ann Sponsler had her husband arrested for bigamy. It is in the encyclopedias. It is in the short biographies. 30 years of a very public life, and there is no docket behind that sentence. Nothing in any jurisdiction at any point ever. The paper trail runs to an arrest for beating a woman in a house on Fifth Avenue, and then the paper trail stops. Everything past that point is a sentence that got repeated until it became furniture. And on the other side of the question, there is nothing at all. No indictment, no trial, no conviction. No court in America ever tried Isaac Merritt Singer for bigamy, not in 1860, not after, not once. In the early autumn of 1860, a few weeks after the arrest, he left the country. He booked passage under the name Simmons. The woman traveling with him was booked as Mrs. Simmons, and she was Kate McGonigal, the 19-year-old sister of the woman who had been sitting on the carriage seat. Some accounts place the flight later and name Mary rather than Kate. What none of them dispute is that he went abroad under a name that was not his, with a woman under a name that was not hers, and that nothing whatsoever compelled him to come back. Mary Ann moved against him, and here the shape of the thing becomes very clear. She did not bring a criminal charge, because she had none to bring. What she brought was a civil action, arguing that the 24 years and the 10 children and the shared name amounted to a common law marriage, and asking the court for a divorce and for alimony. She was not asking the state to punish him, She was asking it to recognize her. The language she filed was not delicate. She swore that across the whole of what she called her married life, he had treated her with cruelty, that he had beaten and choked her into insensibility more than once, and that he had done it hard enough to bring the blood out of her nose and her mouth and her face. And she won. A court awarded her $8,000 a year in temporary alimony, reported at the time as the largest such award the state had ever made. It is a large number. Set it against what the man was worth, and it is a rounding error. And then it was settled, the way these things are settled, out of court and in private. His lawyers were working without him in the room because he was in Europe. They negotiated the yearly figure down to something considerably smaller and handed over one of his large and valuable houses to close it. Then Marianne Sponsler married a man named John Foster. By one account, she did it within a month of the settlement and told nobody, not even her own children, because she understood that a wedding could cost her everything she had just been given. Other accounts put it in 1862, in Boston. What is not in dispute is how he found out. She hurt herself badly in a fall from a chair. She thought she was dying, and believing she was dying, she told one of her daughters that she had remarried. That daughter's husband was an officer of the Singer Company. The news went from the daughter to the son-in-law to the firm, and from the firm to Isaac Singer. And Isaac Singer moved on it immediately. She relinquished every claim she had against him, and she vacated the house. He never had to threaten her. He never had to go near a court. He had built a company. The company had married into her family, and the information walked to him on its own. He married Isabella Eugenie Boyer in New York on the 13th of June, 1863. She was 22. He was 51. The marriage record gives her name as Somerville rather than Boyer. One more small clerical fog in a life full of them. He never answered for any of it. What was left to fight over was the money, and that fight had to wait until he was dead. If you are still here, working through the statute and the settlement and what could and could not be charged, you are exactly who these are made for. Subscribe, and the next one will find you. Chapter 9. 60 Parts. The company reorganized in 1863 as the Singer Manufacturing Company, capitalized at $500,000 across 5,000 shares, with Clark and Singer holding 2,075 shares each, and outside officers paying $200 a share to come in. And Edward Clark, who had spent 12 years working alongside a man he found repellent, finally used the leverage the reorganization gave him. Singer was moved out of the running of the business. He kept the shares and the income and the name on the machines. He lost the company. Clark's view of the matter was never a secret inside the firm. Years later, he would advise a successor to marry before taking the presidency on the grounds that the office required a man respectable enough to hold it. The company Isaac Singer built spent the rest of the century selling an image of the American home, a wife at a clean machine in a clean parlor, and it had no room in that image for the man whose name was cast into the iron. So he left. He built a place at Yonkers first, a thing he called the Castle, and the county did not take to him any better than the Avenue had. In April of 1866, the family sailed for Europe, and Isaac Singer never lived in the United States again. Paris first, a mansion on the Rue Malesherbes, where his son Paris Eugene was born in 1867 and named for the city. Then the Franco-Prussian War came in 1870 and drove them across the Channel. They landed in Devon, at Paynton on the sea. There he built the last and largest of his gestures. He bought an estate and put up an enormous house, more than 100 rooms, designed by a local architect named George Souden Bridgman, with a theater inside it and a rotunda. at a reported cost of about $500,000. He called it the Wigwam. The village called it Old Way. He had made his will on the 16th of May, 1870. On the 14th of July, 1875, his daughter Alice Eastwood Merritt, the child of the Lower Manhattan household, was married at Old Way to a man named William Alonzo Paul LaGrove. By the accounts that survive, LaGrove abandoned her within about a week. 9 days after the wedding, on the 23rd of July, 1875, Isaac Merritt Singer died at Old Way of heart disease. He was 63. The funeral procession through Torquay was reportedly enormous, and he was put into a marble mausoleum in the cemetery there, where a great many of his descendants would follow him. The estate was worth about $13 million. Some accounts put it nearer 14. Either figure made him one of the richest men in America, and the will cut the whole thing into 60 parts. Then the fight started. And the fight is where the thesis of this account stops being an argument and becomes a matter of record. Mary Ann Sponsler came forward as his widow. So, in effect, did the children of all the households. The contest went to the Surrogates Court of Westchester County, which is a phrase worth sitting with for a second. The question of who Isaac Singer's wives had been was going to be decided by a probate judge, dividing property. Her claim failed, and it failed in a way I did not expect when I started reading the file. She actually proved a marriage. Not across the 24 years, because across the 24 years, Catherine Haley was alive and undivorced, and no marriage to anyone else was possible. What she proved was a common-law marriage in the sliver of time after the divorce came through and before she married John Foster, a period of less than a year, which means something nobody in this account ever knew, including her. On the afternoon she stood on that sidewalk and watched the yellow carriage go by with another woman on the seat, she had just become his wife. Not by his choosing and not by hers. By operation of law, in the few months he was single, for the first and only time in 24 years. It took his death and 15 more years for a court to say so out loud, and the sliver did her no good at all, because marrying Foster had ended it. There was no widow. By the accounts that survive, she took about $75,000 and renounced every claim she had against the estate of the man she had lived with for 24 years. The rest was arithmetic. By the reported figures, and the reporting here traces back to a trade paper of the period rather than to the court file itself, the 8 surviving Sponsler children took something on the order of $1.75 million between them. The 5 Matthews children, the McGonigal household, took roughly the same. Alice Eastwood Merritt, the Lower Manhattan daughter, took about $400,000. Catherine Haley's 2 children, the only children of the only marriage he ever legally contracted, were left $500 and $10,000, and it took an agreement among the other heirs to raise them to something like $45,000 each. Isabella and her 6 children took the residue, which was most of it. That sliver of a marriage did reach one person, and only one. Mary Ann's youngest, Caroline Virginia, fell inside it, and so Caroline Virginia was found to be legitimate. 1 child out of 10. The other 9 were, in the language of the period, illegitimate, and the whole difference between them and their sister was a few months of calendar. What strikes me about the whole proceeding is what it was not doing. It was not deciding whether Isaac Singer had wronged anyone. It was not deciding which of those women had been his wife, in any sense a human being would use the word. It was dividing property among claimants. The question of what 24 years had been was never a question any court in the whole affair agreed to hear. The money went where money goes. What it bought, inside a single generation, was the one thing he was never able to buy for himself. Chapter 10. what the law reached. Consider what happened to the children. Winnaretta Eugenie Singer, born in 1865, married Prince Edmond de Polignac in 1893 and became the Princesse Edmond de Polignac. From a house in Paris, she became the most important private patron of modern music in Europe. Fauré, Stravinsky, Satie, Ravel. Work that is still played every week in every concert hall on earth was commissioned with sewing machine money by the daughter of a man who could barely write his own name. Isabelle Blanche Singer married the Duc de Cazes in 1888 with a dowry reported at around $2 million and became a duchess. In 1896, in Paris, she took her own life. She was 27. Adam Mortimer Singer was knighted and endowed a prize for aviation that carried his name. Washington Merritt Grant Singer became Sheriff of Wiltshire and endowed laboratories at a university in the West Country. Paris Eugene Singer took Oldway and rebuilt it as an imitation of Versailles, with French designers brought in to do the grounds. He kept Isadora Duncan. Their son, Patrick, drowned in the Seine in 1913 with Duncan's daughter Deirdre in an accident that is fully and terribly documented. And Paris Singer went to Florida and built the Everglades Club with an architect named Addison Meisner, and in doing so, more or less invented the look of Palm Beach. Isabella herself, widowed at 34 with the residue of a great fortune, went back to Paris and married a Dutch violinist named Victor Rubsay, who a few years later bought himself an Italian title from the King of Italy, which made her a duchess. There is a story that she was the model for the Statue of Liberty. It is repeated constantly, and the evidence for it is very thin. The consensus among people who have looked closely is that Bartholdi used his own mother. So, a princess, a duchess, a knight, a sheriff, and the man who built Palm Beach. Inside one generation. Now, set that against the country the money came out of. A Singer machine cost about $125. A woman sewing shirts for a living in that period earned something on the order of $3 a week. At that wage, she would have to hand over most of a year's entire earnings to own the machine outright, which is why the installment plan existed, and which is why she paid for years. And the machine did not only liberate her. By one contemporary account of a shirt factory in New Haven, the arithmetic ran like this. Before the machines, roughly 2,000 women sewed by hand and produced something like 9,600 shirts a week. After, about 400 women on 400 machines produced 10,000. More shirts, fewer women, and 1,600 of them with no trade. The advertising showed a wife at a clean machine in a clean parlor. The ledger showed 1,600 women who no longer had a trade. And the law that never touched Isaac Singer touched other men constantly. The New York statute put bigamy at up to 5 years in state prison, and ordinary men served it. There is a case of a man who deserted a wife of 23 years and remarried, and got 5 years, with the judge telling him from the bench that he was about as contemptible a specimen as had ever come before him. There is a woman who married 4 times and got 4 years of hard labor, 1 year for each husband. Those particular cases are from a slightly later period than Singer's, and the caution is worth stating. But the statute was the same statute, and it was the one on the books while Isaac Singer ran 3 households under 3 names for a quarter of a century. He served 0 days. Let me stop the clock here because the chronology has done everything it can do. It would be easy to say that a rich man got away with bigamy, and to leave it there. But that is not quite what the record shows, and the thing it shows instead is worse. This is not a story about a man who broke the law and escaped it. It is a story about a man who read the law closely enough to build a life it could never get hold of. What strikes me, when I sit with all of it, is how little the fortune ever had to do anything crude. There is no bribe anywhere in this record. There is no threat to a judge, no bought official, nothing you could point at and call corruption. There is a man who understood that the state protected what it could write down. There is a settlement, a renunciation, a good lawyer, and a statute that only recognized ceremonies. The money did not break the law. It simply stood in the one place the law could not see, and it stayed there for 40 years. What survived was the money. It became a princess and a duchess and a knighthood and a resort town in Florida, and it is still, in a sense, playing in concert halls. The house at Paynton survived and is still standing. What did not survive was the record of the man himself, because he never wrote one. And what did not survive was anything at all of Mary Ann Sponsler's position. There is no document in which the state of New York ever acknowledged that she had been anything to him. She had 10 children by him and buried 2, kept his house for 24 years, and was, in the eyes of every court that ever looked at it, a stranger who had once lived at the same address. So go back to the avenue one more time, the 7th of August, 1860. The yellow carriage comes up Fifth Avenue in the afternoon heat, visible from a long way down the block. There is a woman on the sidewalk who has stopped walking. There is another woman on the seat beside him. Everything else in this account is downstream of that afternoon. But the carriage in that picture is not just a carriage. It is a registered object. Isaac Singer took that vehicle to the patent office and secured it with a number in the Federal Record of the United States, where it has sat ever since and where anyone can still go and look it up. He did that for a piece of painted woodwork. He did it because carriages were property, and property was the one thing that Century knew how to protect, and he had spent 30 years learning exactly what the law would hold and exactly what it would let fall through. Mary Ann Sponsler was the thing it let fall through. The carriage has a number. It is in the Federal Record, and anyone can look it up. 24 years and 10 children do not have one. This is the kind of work this channel exists for. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.